Okay, so this will be the first lectures. I'm using some OBS software. I think this should work out a little better than I originally planned. I might break this into two different sections. Okay, so this week we're going to start where we left off last week, which is we're talking about kind of contract negotiations, right? So we have monopsony, monopoly power. We know that those monopolies made it able to obtain a higher wage from the players union, but if it was a monopsony power from the league or a team, that led to lower wages. And so they kind of argue in between if both of them exist. So if we have two disputing parties and they're sending a proposal to a third party, we'll call this the arbitrator, right? Then I'm going to want to submit a proposal if I'm the monopoly that's as high of a wage as I can, and the other party, like the monopsony, would want to offer or propose it a much lower wage. Right? So the two sides in binding arbitration will say, okay, look, we're going to both submit our proposals, and whatever this third party agrees to, that's what we're going to do. Right? And we have to just accept whatever their decision is. So that's the MLB and the NHL. The NHL, we have both sides proposing to a larger panel, and then the panel has 2 days to kind of decide. MLB, final offer arbitration. This is where the arbitrator can't impose their own solution. So why might this be a little bit better than what the other ones are doing? Well, if I'm the players union, I want to offer the highest wage I can, right? And if I'm the league, offer the lower, and we hope that the difference kind of gets split by the arbitrator. But if there's final offer arbitration, the arbitrator can't split the difference, can't come up with their own solution, well, then it is advantageous, right? If I offer not the highest wage I can as the union, but something a little bit more closer to what would this splitting the difference would have been, I can still end up on top, right? So if we think about, let's say they're arguing over, so let's see if this works here. There we go. So let's say the players union, I don't know, wants the league minimum set at $5 million, and let's say, so we've got the union, we've got the league. Let's say the league wants to set it at, I don't know, 2.5. If it's final offer arbitration, and they both offer this, and he can't split the difference, or he or she can't split the difference, well, then what if the union says, you know what, kind of the middle value in between here, I'll go a little bit closer to what that middle value would be. I still end up with more than 2.5 if they would have accepted the league's kind of offer, and my offer was a little bit more reasonable. So that's kind of how we think about final arbitration, able to get the wage a little bit closer to the middle, and we don't get crazy outrageous offers from both sides or solutions from both sides. Okay, so kind of already mentioned this with the example on the board. And a lot of times this is disputes that are going on that are settled as well. And so 78 players in the MLB filed some type of complaint in 2010, 2011. 6 went to arbitration, and 4 of the 6 lost. So it looks like, well, man, players are not winning whatever these disputes they have about their wages being too low. And so is this really a good thing? Well, if we look at the numbers and think about this, yeah, 4 out of 6 lost, but 6 went to arbitration. What probably happened in those other 72 cases? Well, it was likely that just the threat of this final offer arbitration led whatever teams these players were on to give them higher wages. So, that's why, even though it doesn't look great that 66% of them lost when they go to arbitration, well, a lot of them are avoiding arbitration and obtaining higher wages to begin with, right? So it's kind of where we're at with that. We talked about salary caps a little bit, how they impacted the win optimization of teams, but think about how that affects the individual players as well. So in the NBA, players can only receive right around 50% of all basketball-related income, or that's not only, but that's how much they do receive. There's a scale that's kind of based on experience. So what effect would this have on rosters? Well, if the scale is that for more experience, the higher wages you can expect. This is kind of similar to like a teachers at the primary level. So the longer you teach, the higher your wages are. So what kind of impact is that going to have? Well, after 10 years, if I have to pay this player higher wages and potentially his skill level hasn't increased that much, if there's new labor supply coming in from high school, college players, I'm going to want to substitute out for the exact same quality player, but at a lower wage. Right? So we can see this is probably going to be set. These scales based on experience or age are going to reduce the average age we see in a league that has that instituted. The NHL players receive a little bit more of the league's revenue. No player, though, has, there's an individual cap, not just a team cap, but no player can be 20% of a team's total payroll. Right? And this kind of keeps us from seeing extremely high contracts in the NHL. I mean, there's other reasons as well, not as high of demand, but this also plays a role. So the NFL salary caps, they allow payroll to be varying percentages depending on of different types of revenue. So it's not just overall revenue, could be gate receipts, things like that. Right? There's no individual salary limits, right? And so any one player can receive as high a salary as the team wants. There's a lot more bonuses that are used. So instead of kind of guaranteed money, or instead of just guaranteed money, you also get performance bonuses, right? So these signing bonuses count against the cap, so they still are taken into consideration. But if these bonuses are not easy to obtain, so it's things like if you win the MVP or you have the highest sacks, if it's like incentive, these are performance incentive bonuses, the league's actually said those don't count against the cap. So if it's just signing bonuses, right, like just you get 10 million for signing, right, those count against the cap. But these incentive clauses don't. And so you'll see, teams like this, players probably don't like this as much as just a signing bonus, but it's a way for a confident player who thinks that they're going to be able to obtain some of these goals to actually get a team to agree to a pretty high value contract. Now, it's not a guaranteed, right? Then we're talking about expected value. What's the probability I do lead the league in sacks? But it's still attractive, a lot more attractive to the team because it doesn't count against their cap of how much they can spend. Okay. So what are other things that might impact wages? Rival leagues. So rival leagues will likely lead to higher wages, but how? Okay. So if we think about why would rival leagues lead to higher wages, it's pretty simple, right? So we've got our labor market, we've got our supply and demand for labor, and we've got well, we should do this, right? All right, so the league, they're the ones demanding labor. Never mind. I'm jumping the gun. So what we want to show is that if there is monopsony power, then the league faces a twice as steep marginal expenditure curve. They know players would be willing to play for this much, right? So how could rival leagues increase the equilibrium? Oh, I'm kind of in the way here. Increase the equilibrium wage. Well, basically what they do is they're eliminating the monopsony power, and things go back to where wages are at the equilibrium of a free labor market. Right? So they eliminate the monopsony power and kind of help increase wages, and that's the graph that would go along with it. So hopefully, as I'm using the board, I might be going a little bit quicker, but one advantage is you can pause it if you need to look at what I had, drawn the board a little bit longer. Oh, my animations are off there. So when unions and owners can't compromise, we see strikes or lockouts. So 2011, NBA had a lockout, reduced the number of games in that season. NHL had one in 2012. NFL lost their preseason one year. And the big strike happened in Major League Baseball, right? So we've got lockouts, which is the league saying they're not going to allow players to play. Strikes, which is the players' union say their players aren't going to play, right? So what is a major negative impact of a strike or lockout? Well, I mean, a lot of lost wages for the players, a lot of lost revenue for the teams, right? So how can we understand why these lockouts and strikes happen? So one way we can do this is thinking about contract zones. So we've got a bunch of kind of statements here. I'm going to go to the board and then we'll kind of come back to this. So let's get rid of this. All right, marker here. So if we've got contract zones, let's say the league and the teams are arguing over the number of games. So we could do this for like league minimums or anything else we wanted, but I'm going to just do number of games because it's actually kind of relevant right now. So we've got these two guys. Let's say the union wants to limit the number of games. The league would like more games. Right? And so the players union might say they'd accept anything up to 18 games. The league will accept any number of games that is 16 or higher. So those are our two threat points, right? If, for instance, the union proposes a 15-game season, the league, that's below their threat point, right? So that they're not going to do that, right? Now, if we offered something up here, the league, let's say the league offers 19 games, let's pass the union's threat point, they're going to go on a strike, right? So if the union proposed 15 games, we'd have a lockout because the league doesn't want to agree to that. If we had 19 games proposed by the league, the union doesn't like that. It's past their threat point, there'll be a strike. Okay? Now, let's say that we've got some pessimism going on by the union, right? So the union believes that the team wouldn't accept any number of games less than 19. So they believe that instead of the threat point being here, that it's actually over here. Well, if the union believes that, they're going to think they can't come to an agreement, and they're just going to limit their discussions and their kind of arbitrary, they're bargaining with the league, right? So pessimism can lead to potentially a strike. Kind of conversely, if we had the league believing that the union wouldn't accept any number of games below, above 15, so they would only accept 15 or below, their pessimism might lead to a lockout, right? So what about optimism? Well, optimism can have two potential outcomes. So let's say the union is optimistic about what the league wants. So maybe the union thinks, you know what, the league actually would be willing to accept something below 16. So they offer 15, well, the league doesn't like that, and now there's going to be a lockout. So optimism and pessimism can both lead to these lockouts or strikes. Now, let's say there's a little bit less of an extreme optimism and pessimism. Let's say the union looks at this and says, all right, we want a certain number of games below 18, but we think the league won't accept anything below 17 games. So we're okay with 17. We'd like a lower number of games, so now we're going to propose either 17 or 18 games. Well, they could have actually proposed 16, and the league would have accepted it, right? So there's kind of over pessimism about what the league would like. If it's not too extreme, it could just lead to the union, its pessimism hurting itself. And the same way would work if the league thought, well, the players' union isn't going to accept any number of games past 17. They might propose that. The union's okay with it. But the league really could have got away with proposing 18 games. So that's kind of how we can think about contract zones, optimism and pessimism. And this is a pretty relevant example because right now we just saw that the league and the union have agreed to a 17 game league. So it could look something like this, and who knows, over a couple years, maybe when they come back to bargaining over this again, maybe we end up with a higher. But who knows? The threat point for the union might be at 17. Right? So that's how we can understand contract zones. So this is kind of just what I just said, but putting on the slides here. We've got the threat points and then kind of the effects of optimisms and potentially pessimism. Okay. Another thing we might want to look at is once they come to an agreement, right, if they can set some type of rookie maximums, this is another thing we've seen impact wages, so that wages potentially are actually below the value of the player's marginal product, right, or the demand for their labor. So it might not be in equilibrium. So we have these rookie salary caps kind of implemented. And you kind of see the difference that we get this red line here, which was kind of the old collective bargaining agreement of 2010, and we have the new one of 2011. You can see that we had, sorry, not 2001. Here we have 2015. My bad. You can see that 2015, those new imposed rookie salary maximum caused the salaries to be quite a bit lower for those first round draft picks, or those rookies. Another thing that we can think about impacting the wages we see, or the value of the contracts that we see, are the fact that they're over more than 1 year. If it's a 1 year contract, right, we don't have to worry about the time value of money. But if it's a 10-year contract and I'm getting $10 million every year, well, what's the problem with that? $10 million 10 years from now isn't worth as much, right? So I'm thinking about, would I rather have $10 million today or tomorrow? Well, if, we have any type of inflation at all, I'd rather have $10 million today. Right? And so the value kind of if I had the $10 million today, I could invest it, earn whatever the interest rate is on it, so 10 million times 1 plus whatever the interest rate is. So I would always rather have the money today, right? Or said differently, the value next year is only worth 10 million divided by 1 point something, right? Which makes it a smaller value. So teams, if we think about what do teams and players, what does this mean for them? Well, that means teams are always going to want to backload contracts. If I'm giving you $20 million, I'd rather give it to you 10 years from now than today. So if I have to give you a certain amount every year, what I'll try to do is structure it so 5 million the first year, 6 million the second, 7 the third, so on and so forth, right? And players, if they're rational or have an agent helping them, would always like it to be front loaded, right? 10 million today, 9 million next year, 8 million the year following that, so on and so forth. So a lot of times you see these reported salary amounts, a lot of times they're backloaded. So they're not really $250 million contracts. We'd have to discount the amount of money they're making, especially if it's a 10-year contract. So you see it's a lot in baseball, longer contracts that are really backloaded. So what's one type of contract that allows players to really exploit the time value of money? Well, signing bonuses. If they'd rather have the money now, if I can get huge signing bonuses, that's getting me the bulk of my money today and not spreading it out over the next 10 years. I always thought this was kind of a fun little anecdote with Michael Jordan. So Michael Jordan signed an eight-year, $25 million contract in 1990, or ended in 1996. The following 2 years he made, when he came back, 30 and 33 million. Right? So in those 2 years that he came back, he more than doubled what he made the first 8 years he played. Right? So arguably one of the best players in the NBA, made right around $100 by the end of his NBA career. If you look at other players, Zach Randolph and Rasheed Wallace, and I don't think this it kind of includes his Washington Wizards money, but Zach Randolph and Rasheed Wallace actually made right around that amount as well, right? Which is, I think most people would argue they're not near the quality player that Michael Jordan was. So some say that he actually could have argued for more money. What would one reason be why in those years where he signed the $30 and $33 million contract, he might have taken less money from the Bulls? Talked about this a little bit last week, but it's not always just wages that the player is getting from choosing that team. It's potentially that when a player chooses, say, the Chicago Bulls, right, he's getting not just the wage they pay him, but also money from other markets, like advertisement, right? Nike for Jordan. And maybe moving would have somewhat damaged what his kind of being the Chicago guy. That was really his image. And so if that damaged his image at all and allowed him to make less money outside of just his wages from the NBA, then it would be more profitable to stay on the Chicago Bulls. So the Jordan brand would have been hurt. You can think about LeBron James moving. Did he potentially lose out on money? Or maybe with him, maybe the market he was going to offered higher non-wage earnings as well. So how much less could the Bulls have offered Jordan? Well, if you think about how much less could they have offered him, it depends on the difference in what he would have made if he stayed and what he would have made if he left, right? In terms of just the advertising dollars, or I say advertising dollars, not advertising to him, but like the contracts he signed with Nike and how much money his brand made from staying with the Bulls. So that is kind of always fun. So it's kind of to end some of these outside factors we think that might impact wages. And we're going to move to the next real topic, which is discrimination. All right? So there might be discrimination that can impact wages as well, so that wages are below what the actual value of the marginal product of labor is for our player. So the first one we'll talk about is employer discrimination. So let's assume we have two types of players, and we could break this down to whatever group we think is being discriminated against. But for right now, I'm going to do domestic foreign. Right? So you might see this like in the European Soccer League a lot. You think you could argue that maybe in the NBA some of this goes on with the United States versus non-US players. So let's assume for now they both have the same marginal product of labor, or they're both adding the same number of additional wins, like the marginal wins for adding that unit of labor is the same between domestic and foreign players. Employers, if they have discrimination against foreign players, this results in an additional cost when they employ them. So they get the value of that player, but they also, this additional cost is going to be incurred, right? So it really decreases the value of that player to the team. So we can think of what this is doing is essentially the demand curve for labor, right? The demand curve for labor, we said, was the marginal number of wins that that player adds times the marginal revenue per win. Okay? So this is going to be for our domestic players. And now for our foreign players, we're going to have this additional cost C. So what that does is, let's assume we have the same supply. So here's our domestic players. We have the same supply of kind of both domestic and foreign players, but this additional cost for foreign players decreases the demand curve. So now when we look at wages of domestic and foreign players have a lower wage. We could also think about the number. So we'll say this is domestic, foreign. The number of players we see also decreases. Right? So we see lower wages, equilibrium wages, and a lower quantity of those foreign players, or the group that was being discriminated against. So, you know, we kind of have, I have both those things kind of summed up here, and then we have the graph to go along with it. So what if we have free agency where we can see teams move, and we also have discrimination, right? Move between teams, and we have also discrimination. Well, if all teams discriminate, then lower wages will exist for that discriminated group, right? However, what happens if just one team owner does not discriminate, right? Well, you can use the graph to understand this. So let's say one team doesn't discriminate. If that team doesn't discriminate, they're not facing this demand curve for the foreign players. They're facing this demand curve, right? So they'd be willing to pay, and I didn't draw this very level before, but they'd be willing to pay that higher wage. Well, the problem is if they're the only team, right, they don't have to get away, they don't have to pay this wage. I could actually offer a wage down here, as long as it's slightly above whatever that player could get from a discriminating team. I can really offer a wage right down to that point, right? And so wages may not change if there's only one employer who's non-discriminating. All right? So it may not be bargaining down all the way down to that point. They might be worried that the player might, you know, be insulted or something like that. But really, if there's only one team, we could see the wage go all the way down to the wage that the discriminating teams are offering for that foreign player. What happens though if we have half the teams are discriminating, half aren't? Well, really all we need are two teams that are not discriminating, because as long as there's two teams that are not discriminating, they'd be willing to pay this wage. But if they try to undercut it, well, now there's another team that can just offer a wage slightly above them. Then the second team offers it slightly above them. And really, with just two teams, the competition would drive those wages for whatever the group is that's being discriminated against up to the equilibrium wage where it should be, right at the value of that player to the team, the value of their marginal product of labor. Also, I apologize for not always looking in the webcam. We really just need two teams. So if half the teams are non-discriminating, then we're more than okay, right? And also the teams that are discriminating, right, are actually getting lower quality players, right? They're choosing to pay higher wages to these whatever the group is that they're not discriminating against, and so they don't have as much money, especially if we have a cap, to spend on their entire team, and whatever the discriminating teams are would end up kind of at the bottom of the league, whatever the non-discriminating teams were would end up at the top. So non-discriminating teams, quality gets better, and hopefully over time this drives teams, the incentive to discriminate goes way down for them, right? Because now there's actually a cost to discriminating and not a cost it's not an additionally imposed cost discriminating, but in discriminating there's an opportunity cost of losing out on additional revenue from having a higher quality team. So do wages tell the whole story, right? If we look at some wages and we say, well, look, on average, we look at foreign players and domestic players and we see foreign player wages are much lower, right? Well, not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. So let's assume now that we have foreign players that are more productive, right, than the domestic, and there's still discrimination against foreign players. Would the wage still be lower, right, with the discrimination? Well, let's draw a scenario where we've got, let's see if this color shows up a little bit better. Nope, not at all. We'll stick with black. So, our quantity for labor, we got our wages. So, if the demand curve for labor for domestic players is right here, well, we know that the demand for labor is this. If foreign players are more productive, then that means the demand curve for foreign players, this would be higher, which means the demand curve for foreign players would be higher, right? So potentially something like this, and I'll throw in our supply curve there as well, right? But now we've got discrimination, right? So now if we've got discrimination, here's the demand curve for foreign players with the discrimination, right? So wages for foreign players will be here, and wages for domestic players will be here. So if we just look at the actual data, like the actual salaries and the wages, it may look like that foreign players aren't being discriminated against, but that's only because if they originally had some higher level of talent to begin with, well, they're still going to look like they're being paid higher wages, but not as high as what they should be getting paid, right? They should be getting paid a wage that's up here. Okay. So that's how that would work. So how can we maybe end discrimination, not with policy, but with really just economics? So prior to the integration of Major League Baseball, black players started their own league, right? So Major League Baseball wouldn't employ, black players that are being discriminated against, and so they said, well, look, we can make money. We're going to start our own league. Demand was fairly high for that league as well, resulting in player values being pretty high and wages being pretty high as well. Okay? So once integration occurred, right, the demand curve for the Negro League, right, declined, because now we're seeing black players also in Major League Baseball, which dropped the value of players and wages in the Negro League, right? So even with discrimination from employers, the wages in the MLB, because their marginal revenue per win was so much higher, they were able to offer wages even with discrimination, right, lower wages based on discrimination, that were higher than what the Negro League could compete with, right? So eventually this kind of forced the Negro League to cease to exist, but the problem was, well, now we have black players in Major League Baseball, but they're not getting paid as high wages as they could. Yeah, it's higher wages than what they were earning in a smaller, less demanded league, right? But still below what they should be getting paid in a more popular league. So what helped cause the integration? What helped cause us to kind of see an increase in wages? So the reason why we saw this transition of players to Major League Baseball, it wasn't because it was imposed, there was no mandate. It was really that the best players in the Negro League just got really, really good, right? And so their marginal wins they could add from adding that additional unit of labor, that MWL part of the demand curve, that goes really high for those players, which was just a huge opportunity cost for teams if they didn't sign those players, right? And also you can think about the supply of low-wage white players. It was pretty exhausted, and it really was that even with this additional taste for discrimination, it was like the scenario that I just drew with the domestic and foreign players. If the marginal wins per labor from the black players was so much higher, they would still be willing to pay them higher wages than these low-wage, low-quality white players that they already had. So as the competition from the Negro League started to decrease, it gave monopoly power to some of these teams, and so the Negro League was also kind of reducing Major League Baseball's revenues because it was stealing some of its monopoly power. So that's why they were, by taking some of its players and driving it out, they're also better off in that instance. Okay. So what caused integration? It was really that there was just a huge opportunity cost for the teams not to sign these high quality players in the Negro League, especially when they could do so at lower wages, since all teams were discriminating at the time. So can employer discrimination be justified? Well, not in the context of the example we were just talking about, but if one group has a higher productivity level than another group, then you may want to look at the statistical averages, and you might statistically discriminate, right? So if you know that on average someone who is over 6 feet tall tends to have a higher probability of being a successful quarterback, then you may statistically discriminate against people who are under 6 feet tall, right? So it doesn't have to be based off of race. It can be based off of attributes as well. And so statistical discrimination in terms of attributes actually makes some sense, right? It kind of justified, because we know the expected value of what the team is going to get from a quarterback under 6 foot isn't as high as the expected value if they drafted someone over 6 foot, assuming all else is equal, obviously. So, if information is hard to get, like it's hard to know if a college player will be successful at the next level, employers might resort to this statistical discrimination. But the problem is, if these small differences in group statistics lead to different hiring or drafting decisions, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I don't think that a quarterback under 6 foot can be successful, I don't draft him, I don't give him a start, I don't start him, I don't give him an opportunity, well then yeah, it's going to look like there aren't ever any quarterbacks under 6 foot who get, who are able to be successful. So we've talked about employer discrimination. We'll also talk about employee discrimination. So employees may discriminate against employers, in the sense that if I'm a discriminating employee, I don't want to work for a team, right, or an employer who hires whatever group I'm discriminating against, right? So maybe if we go back into the 1940s and 50s, if there were players who didn't like, who discriminated against other, who would discriminate against black players, they wouldn't have wanted to be with an employer who had black players on the team, right? They would have wanted to be with an employer who had only white players, right? So if they had to play for an employer who had black players on the team, they didn't feel like they were getting their wage. They felt like they were getting their wage times something less than 1, right? So this is their kind of taste for discrimination. As that gets higher, it goes from 0 to 1. So if they had a complete taste for discrimination and this is 1, they felt like they're getting $0 from a team if they have black players on it. They would never sign with that team, right? So really what this does is it kind of shifts the supply curve, right? I would have to be paid a higher wage, right? Let's assume that this was 0.5, this taste for discrimination. I would then have to be paid twice as high of a wage on a team that had players that I was discriminating against, as opposed to a team that had only players that I liked, or in my example, white versus black, right, in Major League Baseball at the time. So what's going to happen to wages? We're going to see higher wages would have to be paid if I'm on a team where there's employees that I dislike, but potentially lower wages if I'm on a non-discriminated team because they know they can kind of get me at a discount. Right? So I think I left this open. Well, I'll draw I wanted to draw something here before we move to the next slide. So we talked about employee discrimination. We can think about it as shifting the supply curve. So we've got supply curve, demand curve for labor. All right, this is the wage. I don't want to do the equilibrium wage yet. Let's say we've got some taste for discrimination going on. So it's going to be a shift in the supply curve such that if we think about to supply the same quantity of labor, if I'm discriminating against the team, I would have to be getting, so we'll call this discrimination, at this quantity of labor on a team that had no players that I discriminated against, I would take this wage. But on a team that had players that I discriminated against, I would, I'm looking at this right here. I would need that much higher wage to play for that team and supply that same quantity of labor. So to get the same amount of units of quality of labor from a player, if they were discriminatory, they would have to be paid a higher wage, and so then teams that have the black players wouldn't have wanted to sign these discriminatory players. So what's that gonna result in? Oh, there we go. Well, it's gonna result in kind of, you see teams that kind of have a lot of the discriminated group players, and then teams that have a lot of the players who are discriminated, or employees who are discriminated. So in 1947, Jackie Robinson was about to become the first African American player. So I talked a little bit already about this kind of integration of the Negro League into Major League Baseball. There was Dodgers players, so 5 mediocre players were traded for one player who was willing to play with Jackie Robinson. So the Dodgers had 5 discriminating employees, and they traded them all away to get one kind of mediocre player that would have played with Jackie because his quality was that high, right? So at the time, I always liked this kind of little speech from the manager, which was, I hear that some of you don't want to play for Robinson, some of you have drawn a petition, but you know what you can do with that petition. I hear Dixie Walker is like writing a letter to be traded, who was a good player at the time. We'll just hand him the letter, you're gone. I don't care if a fellow's yellow, black, or if he has strikes like you fill in the blank, zebra. I'm the manager and I say he plays. I'll play an elephant if he can do the job, make room for him to send my brother home. He's going to win his pennants. He's going to put money in your pockets and money in mine. So this last one is what I love, because what he's saying is, look, I don't care. Sometimes, economics and discrimination because of simply people's love for money, right? Which maybe morally you don't like, but we do see that just the incentive, right? Incentives matter, and here money incentives helped to kind of decrease the amount of discrimination that was going on. So if employees discriminate but employers don't, does it really matter, right? So we have this employee discrimination going on. We know that they're going to want higher wages. The short answer is it really doesn't matter, because over time, right, they're just going to sign non-discriminating employees, right? Because the value that they're losing out on, the opportunity cost of not signing players from this discriminated against group is so high. So, we already talked a little bit. If employees discriminate, teams actually have to pay them a much higher wage. If you did a little bit of rearranging, players felt like they got the wage times this, then the wage they would actually need would be this wage divided by that. So the group who doesn't discriminate will always take the equilibrium wage, so you can always get them at a cheaper price, right? Because if 1 minus something between 0 and 1, that's going to be something less than 1. So when I divide the wage by that, it'll always be higher. So I have to pay this discriminating employer a higher wage than whatever the equilibrium wage would be for that quality level of a player. So all else equal, the teams will always hire non-discriminating players first. So we'll end up with rosters that have more non-discriminating players over time. So what's another alternative that you could see employers take? It could be that you end up with kind of teams that had all whatever the discriminating group was, and all, whatever the kind of non-discriminating employees were. Which is kind of what happened initially at the time when we saw the first kind of integration of black players into Major League Baseball. Or you can just outright ban that group of players that's being discriminated against, which would then keep wages low for all the discriminating employees and cause these separate leagues, which is what we originally had before the incentives got too high to kind of incentivize this integration. Okay. So the last type of discrimination that we're going to talk about is consumer discrimination. I'm going to pause right here and create 2 recordings. So this one will stop, and I'll pick up and then where we left off in the next one.